If you ever wonder why you can keep going even when you feel completely drained inside, this is for you. Emotional exhaustion doesn't always show up as tears or collapse. Often, it shows up as capability, as reliability, as someone who keeps functioning even when something inside feels hollow. You wake up, you get through the day, you respond to messages, you meet expectations, you smile when required. From the outside, nothing looks wrong, but internally, there's a quiet emptiness you can't quite explain. Not sadness exactly, not despair, just a persistent sense that you're running on something thin. Emotionally exhausted adults are rarely dramatic about their pain. They're usually the opposite. They're the ones people trust, the ones who stay calm, the ones who don't burden others with how they're feeling. They're dependable, composed, and self-contained, and that's often how the exhaustion begins. It doesn't start with a breaking point. It starts gradually, less patience than before, less interest in things that once felt meaningful, waking up tired even after sleeping, a subtle heaviness that follows you through the day. Because emotional exhaustion isn't about how busy you are. It's about how much you're carrying internally without release. What makes this especially confusing is that life may look stable on the surface. There may be responsibilities, routines, even achievements. But rest doesn't seem to restore anything, because the fatigue isn't physical. It's emotional. It comes from holding too much in for too long. Many emotionally exhausted adults learned early that emotions were something to control. Maybe vulnerability wasn't welcomed. Maybe being strong was praised while expressing needs felt inconvenient. Maybe they had to grow up quickly, become mature, be the one who listens, adapts, and keeps things smooth. Over time, they absorbed a quiet belief. Their value came from how much they could handle. So they handled everything: pressure, conflict, other people's emotions, responsibilities that weren't really theirs. And because they managed it well, no one questioned the cost. Emotional exhaustion often develops in highly empathetic people, people who notice everything: shifts in tone, unspoken tension, changes in mood. When you're wired this way, every interaction requires effort. Every relationship involves emotional monitoring. And when there's no space to unload that weight, it accumulates. Eventually, the nervous system gets tired of being alert. This is when numbness appears. Not because the person doesn't care, but because caring constantly without rest is unsustainable. The mind protects itself by turning the volume down. Joy feels muted. Sadness feels distant. Even anger loses its edge. Many describe it as feeling flat, not deeply unhappy, but not fully alive. Life becomes something to manage rather than experience. From the outside, this numbness can look like detachment or laziness. From the inside, it feels like living with a permanent low battery warning. Irritability is another sign. When emotional reserves are depleted, small things feel overwhelming. Minor interruptions feel invasive, not because the person is unreasonable, but because there's no buffer left. When you've been holding yourself together for years, even small cracks feel threatening. This often comes with guilt. Why can't I just be grateful? Why does this feel so hard when others seem fine? But this comparison is misleading. You're comparing your internal load to someone else's visible behavior. Everyone carries different invisible weight. Unexpressed emotions add another layer. Feelings that aren't processed don't disappear. They settle into the body as tension, as restlessness, as shallow breathing, as chronic fatigue. When expressed emotions doesn't feel safe, people learn to analyze instead of feel. They can explain their emotions clearly, but rarely feel relief from them. Over time, this creates disconnection. They know what they should feel. They remember what they used to feel, but accessing it feels distant. Relationships often become complicated here. Emotionally exhausted adults still care deeply, but connection feels draining. Conversations feel like effort. Even loved ones can feel overwhelming. This creates an inner conflict, wanting closeness but needing distance. Withdrawal follows, not from lack of care, but from lack of energy. Unfortunately, others may interpret this as disinterest, reinforcing belief that something is wrong with them. There is also grief, quiet, unacknowledged grief, for the version of themselves that felt lighter, for the ease they once had. This grief doesn't come from one event. It comes from accumulation, years of self-denial, compromise, and emotional restraint. Identity is deeply affected. Many emotionally exhausted adults define themselves by what they provide. When their energy drops, they don't just feel tired. They feel useless. Rest feels uncomfortable. Slowing down feels like failure. So they keep pushing, telling themselves things will improve after the next obligation. But there's always another demand waiting. They are often high-functioning, which makes their struggle invisible. They meet expectations while running on borrowed energy. Over time, motivation fades. Focus slips, meaning feels distant. Not because purpose is gone, but because the emotional system is depleted. At its core, emotional exhaustion is communication, a signal that something needs attention. Not necessarily dramatic change, but honest limits. One of the hardest truths is this: strength doesn't mean being endless. Strength without recovery becomes depletion. Another hard truth is that not everything has to be carried alone. But for those who learned early to rely on themselves, this feels unsafe. Emotional exhaustion isn't failure. It's survival without enough nourishment. Healing doesn't start with fixing. It starts with noticing. The fatigue beneath productivity. The numbness beneath calm. The sadness beneath strength. The nervous system doesn't need more discipline. It needs safety. Emotional safety. The kind that allows rest without guilt. Expression without consequence. Mistakes without shame. When safety has been missing, the body stays alert even in calm moments. Silence feels wrong. Relaxation feels unfamiliar. The mind keeps scanning for problems. Self-abandonment quietly follows. Needs are overridden. Signals ignored. Over time, people lose touch with themselves. This disconnection feels normal because it developed gradually. And because it feels normal, it's rarely questioned. Emotionally exhausted adults are often self-aware, but awareness without compassion becomes another burden. They regulate constantly, stay composed, explain instead of feel. There is loneliness in being the stable one. People assume you're okay. Eventually, you stop correcting them. Time begins to feel heavy, not because the future is bad, but because it requires energy you're not sure you have. Gratitude becomes a way to silence pain. But gratitude can coexist with truth. One doesn't erase the other. Emotional exhaustion often appears during identity shifts, when roles pile up without support. When adaptation replaces fulfillment, many feel like they disappear gradually, not by choice but by survival. The hardest step is admitting something needs to change, not dramatically, just differently. Rest feels risky because it brings up what was postponed. So busyness becomes protection. Healing begins with permission to rest, to feel, to say no. Guilt will appear. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It means old conditioning is being challenged. Letting go of over-responsibility isn't selfish. It's necessary. Emotional exhaustion is not weakness. It's the cost of being strong for too long without safety. And noticing that is where reconnection begins.